Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to the second section of South-South Forum on Sustainability. The theme of the second section is ecological justice through social transformation. But we have a discussion in the first section. The title is proposed to change from ecological justice through socialist transformation. It is proposed by V.J. Prasad in the first section, so we can continue the debate about the title. However, now we can continue this section, and the first speaker will be Rebecca Johnson, and she is the feminist peace activist, 1980s Greenham peace camper, justice campaigner opposing war and violence through Women in Black and Million Women Rights. She is also founding co-chair of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, 2017 Nobel Peace Laureate. And she is also Green Security spokesperson from UK and Acronym Institute Director.
Good afternoon, and everyone. So, or good evening, in fact, I should be saying. I've never done the share screen, so I'm actually just going to ignore that. I've just got 6 slides that I was just going to show to kind of illustrate. And so that would be very kind. If the organizers would show that, and then I can just put it on. So if that's possible, that would be really helpful for me. Well, good evening, Tsui, Jade, and everybody who's here. It's so lovely to be joining you in the South-South Forum on Sustainability for this 7th year, having participated very fully last year, actually in Hong Kong. So the subject that I decided to take on this was actually to focus on the challenges of Green New Deals and also the Extinction Rebellion grassroots uprising for the climate, and to talk just a little bit about how I see initiatives like that originated here in the UK. I'm calling you from the UK this morning, and how they might fit in. So, in fact, the first slide was just one of the songs from the Extinction Rebellion demonstrations in London during 2019. And it was a combination of a song and a chant, because it was a way to sort of really bring a lot of people together while they were locking down and in fact occupying, if you like, iconic locations like, oh, thank you, I can see that now on my screen, thanks, Jade. So so this song, I think it was a way to sort of bring people together in quite a frightening situation, actually, when we had hundreds and in some cases thousands locked on to a boat in Oxford Circus, and onto and blockading and in fact planting trees right across Waterloo Bridge. I'm mentioning some of these because I think they're names of places in London that some of the audience might also know if you visited London. Very iconic. We had the young people took over Piccadilly Circus, the youth strike for the climate group. We had Oxford Circus, the main shopping hub that is usually a nightmare that I avoid. I ended up there for 2 or 3 days because I was the legal observer on behalf of people who had locked onto the boat that said "Tell the truth," and they were chanting and singing to keep their spirits up and also to unify in a very frightening situation because, of course, they knew they would be arrested. It was only a matter of time. They were completely non-violent, but you never know how, excuse me, how the police might be. So that's my contribution to the panel, wants to be looking at how those two kind of UK originated movements sort of have spread a little bit into at least some areas of the world, and to have a discussion about, do those sorts of things contribute to social transformation, and if so, how? And I'm going to be arguing that the social transformations that are needed to bring about ecological justice will require non-violent grassroots activism at a local and indeed national levels, but combined with national and international political action and diplomacy to move away from capitalism and to end the exploitative military-industrial economic structures and policies before it's too late. Next slide, please. So I'm a European feminist and an ex-Peace coordinator and activist. And I'm not suggesting that Extinction Rebellion and Green New Deal concepts should actually attempt to be leadership in how we address climate justice internationally. On the contrary, what I'm actually saying is that their Euro-Atlantic origins, and I'll talk a little bit about how Green New Deal is looked at in the US and in a few other countries, but it has a Euro-Atlantic origin. And in fact, that, yes, it contains historic privileges that in today's world means that particularly the white people in these countries have gained from what we call white privilege, that in this world, that actually means that we must take responsibility for undoing the harm that was passed down through generations from how power was wielded by our ancestors. And I'm not talking about, you know, issues of guilt and blame at this point. I'm saying it's about an issue of responsibility that people like me from the Euro-Atlantic countries recognize and believe that it is vital that we should take up. And this slide just really wants to acknowledge and recognize that a huge part of Extinction Rebellion is this recognition. I just wanted to start this session then by putting us sort of on the table. We're currently on track for between 3 and 5 degrees of warming in the world. And this is a death sentence for countless people in the global south. And Caroline Lucas MP, who is the only Green Member of Parliament and happens to be a long-standing good friend of mine, and also the MP for Brighton, which is very near, Brighton Pavilion, which is very near where I live. And all her life she's worked on these environmental issues. And a while ago, a few years ago, I joined the Green Party, and I'm actually the Security, Peace and Defence spokesperson for the Green Party in England and Wales. So I work closely with Caroline on issues like climate and security, peace and defence. And she gave a really important speech linking these issues in September of last year. I've only got a couple of quotes from this, but I just want to start with this because it is that recognition of climate and environmental destruction constituting really the highest security risk that we have globally, nationally, locally. We're currently, and how that affects migration, economic systems, food scarcity, and that this will only carry on kind of endangering the whole world through war and militarization. and indeed the legacies of rapacious colonialism, racism, and military-industrial systems of genocide, exploitation, and war now has led us to this brink in the world where we all now face the interconnected annihilation level threats to our survival, and it's to our collective survival, whether or not we were part of building the weapons or polluting the planet with military industrial emissions, the global greenhouse gas emissions, the GHG. And these three, as I see them, interconnected extinction level threats are climate destruction, rapidly spreading pandemics, such as we've seen with COVID-19, and we're very conscious of now, and nuclear war. And although I'm not going to talk about pandemics, I want to acknowledge that here because there are a whole number of different kinds of ways in which the rapid spread of disease is both a construct in some ways of our military industrial ways of life, and then it spreads rapidly around the world, and therefore to very vulnerable nations through things like air travel, which of course has been a mechanism of capitalism in the late 20th and then 21st century. Next slide, please. And so this quote comes from the great Vandana Shiva, a very important eco-feminist thinker, writer, and most importantly, an activist, combining those things. And in the foreword that she wrote for the Extinction Rebellion Handbook, she made this point, that the extermination of biological diversity and indigenous cultures that know how to live in peace with Mother Earth is part of one extinction, one interconnected war against life. Ecocide and genocide are one indivisible process, and they began with the idea of the colonization of Earth as the, quote, civilizing mission of a, quote, superior race. Next slide, please. And I think that's really that's my slide, really, because as a European feminist, I want to take up that responsibility that I think we have. And we don't know how this is going to play out. Mistakes, human or technological errors, insane or foolish leaders, and we can all think of at least a few of those, at least in some countries, may trigger catastrophes. Or we may delay annihilation for a few more decades, but we live under a sword of Damocles. Our children, our grandchildren, our future generations, their futures will be decided by how we act now. And that's the fundamental point that I'm wanting to make with this. And this is the fundamental point being made through Extinction Rebellion and a whole lot of the climate protests. And time is running out. And so I'm also connecting this in with the movement of children, of youth, such as Greta Thunberg. And I just put 3 quotes up here. And this was actually, I took this photograph in April of 2019, last year, outside the Houses of Parliament. And it was a lovely photo because of how children were very much part of this particular protest, and the rebel for life, or rebel for life, you could look at it 2 different ways, as who we are, but also what we need to do, which is to rebel. And these three quotes at different times from Greta explained, we children, you know, she was 16 or 15, I think, 15, 16, when she herself went out by herself because she couldn't get, at that point, you know, other children weren't joining her. She just decided she had to go out, and she just sat, no matter what the weather, with her placards saying, you know, schools strike for the climate, outside the parliament in Sweden, which was her country. That's also important to recognize how we have responsibilities in our own countries. We have solidarity with those in other countries, but our responsibility, our political responsibility, lies with our own country and our own governments, which is also why I've chosen this part of this of the topic on climate justice to focus on in my talk. She also said, treat the climate crisis like the acute crisis it is. And finally, and I love this, no one is too small to make a difference. Next slide. And really that last quote was also how we mobilized against nuclear weapons in the 1980s, when I was a much younger woman, at Greenham. We were saying, you know, we listen to the scientists, but we can make a difference if we join together. No one is too weak, too alone, too small to make a difference, because if we connect ourselves up like droplets connecting into a great river, or like strands, fragile strands on a spider's web, but when the spider weaves that web, she weaves between like trees, and we wove webs across the fences, and this becomes very, very strong. And it's through working together that we, however small or fragile we might be, can make the real political differences. So then, and that's what we have to do. And we all have roles to play as we collectively try to stop climate destruction and construct new social and economic relations and institutions to transform the power imbalance in the world, share the Earth's resources more equitably, according to need and not profit, and create the laws, norms, structures, and institutions for much fairer international political, economic, and security systems. For climate justice, those who created the worst pollution and greenhouse gases that have brought the world to the brink of ecocide have larger responsibilities than anyone else to stop, to cut out military industrial activities, and to take less from the Earth's resources. How we do that politically and socially is the driving objective of the Green New Deal proposals, and if you like, is the driving motivation of Extinction Rebellion. International climate justice means redistributing the burdens arising from climate destruction from the poorer nations, essentially the global south, onto the richer countries, the Euro-Atlantic or global north. And of course, what we actually see is the opposite happening. We're seeing the burden constantly falling on global south nations, whether Bangladesh, low-lying, facing loss of a lot of its land through flooding, the small island states of the Pacific who have persisted for centuries, millennia, and now face completely losing through the sea level rise, and the desertification of areas in Africa that mean that people can no longer grow food to sustain themselves. The burden is coming on the global south, but the crime has been committed and continues to be committed by the military industrial activities of the global north. But the global south also exists within the north. And this needs to be taken into account in our countries as well. By this, I mean to identify that, for example, in the UK and US, there are communities, first and foremost, the Black and Asian, minoritized ethnic communities. They're citizens of the UK and indeed in Europe, the empires that were built, over the last few centuries. And we see that both in their own countries, but those who are now living as British citizens in our country are disproportionately affected by racism, discrimination, educational disadvantage, and poverty. And these communities also are overrepresented in low pay levels of work, for example, in the health, care, transport sectors, receiving low pay, often living in rented accommodation, in crowded conditions, and so on. And in these coronavirus times, these people are the disadvantaged members of UK society, the most disadvantaged members, together with the much older people living in care homes. And indeed, it is representatives of many of these communities from, Asia and Africa and the Philippines, and who work in our care homes. They are the ones catching COVID-19 in higher numbers and dying from it in higher numbers. And so when we seek climate justice, all of us have to work in partnership on social transformation to address inequalities, power structures, and allocations of resources and opportunities within our societies. And at the same time, we have to work internationally to enable shared leadership and redistribution of resources towards the peoples and nations who are suffering most as a consequence of climate chaos, nuclear weapons, and disadvantage in terms of access to health services, for example. The Green New Deal and Extinction Rebellion offer two kinds of approaches that may be a way our country and people can contribute to climate justice and to socialist transformation. They may or may not be appropriate for other countries and cultures. Our starting point is in questions. And my first is, can we imagine, can we think about and construct sustainable economies, cooperative institutions, and post-patriarchal social relations in time to prevent the destruction of the earth and ecocide? Can we find better ways to relate globally, share resources, and transcend the stranglehold of military-industrial growth, competition, and consumption? I argue that the current emergencies need to be tackled globally, and that the most effective leadership will come from peoples who have suffered most from the toxic policies of the past: women, indigenous and minoritized people, and the global south. And that's really the central aspect that I'm going to be talking about. The highest polluters and emitters of climate-destroying greenhouse gases are countries that are most heavily dependent on military-industrial, growth-based, extractivist economies. Capitalism, in other words. They cannot lead us out of these crises because they are trapped in their histories and delusions. The biggest obstacles to climate justice and social transformation are to be found in the Bretton Woods capitalist club and also state-controlled communist ideologies. It is possible and desirable for our countries to take forward green economic and social proposals and enact policies to turn things round and end reliance on military-industrial behaviours, production and consumption. This will only happen, however, if young, progressive and this will only happen if young, progressive and minoritized people who are marginalized in our countries rise up and put unstoppable pressure on the vested interests, the politicians and institutions that hold the reins of power. And that's what I'm focusing on. So the Green New Deal originated, as I've said, in the UK. And it was really intended to talk about what we'd have to do to our own economy to transform our economic and social policies to tackle the climate emergency through public investment in care, to resilience, renewable energy, sustainable jobs, to build back better after, and it was talked about, and this is where its origins are, the 2008 financial crisis that had been caused by years of profligate casino capitalism, as we call it, by irresponsible banks and investors. So I'm not going to go into detail about that, but it was the Green New Deal was the basis of the Green Party's manifesto in the 2019 election. It's also been taken up by Labour Party, who committed their government committed their party. But of course, as we know, the 2019 election was won on the slogan, "Get Brexit Done," and brought in Boris Johnson, and vital issues such as climate destruction, health, green economic and social policies just really received very, very little airtime and discussion. In the United States last year, it was Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, a Democrat from New York, who took the lead to put the Green New Deal ideas on the table with her resolution in Congress. And again, I'm not going to have time to go into more detail, but it will be in my paper. And she really worked very closely with the Black women within the leadership given by women of color in the climate justice movement, and also the youth. And I had a little quote in the paper from the Sunrise Movement, which is a youth-led. And so we see Green New Deal's kind of ideas spreading across Europe, spreading to Canada, New Zealand Labour government also connecting with some of these ideas, Australia. Most interestingly and importantly, in April this year, South Korea's Democratic Party won a compelling majority with its climate manifesto that explicitly linked the pledge to reach net zero emissions by 2050. Most Green New Deals look at 2030 because they say the emergency is such that we have to really do it within the next 10 years. But the South Korean government has been really one of the first outside that sort of Euro-Atlantic to really take this issue on, at least so far on paper, if you like, in policies, talking about the investment in renewable energy and phasing out fossil fuels and supporting transition to green jobs. And so voters there are now looking to President Moon Jae-in to develop and implement what needs to be done. So it is, extending internationalists, but at the same time, we're then seeing people like, for example, Janice Varufakis, former Greek foreign minister. He wrote an article late last year, where he then starts to talk about that it has to be a globally agreed Green New Deal. And I think he's wrong with that. And my paper talks about that a bit more and quotes some of the points. He's really focusing in a very kind of linear way on economics only, as he does, because he's really been brought up through the Marxist tradition, another Euro-Atlantic set of kind of insights built on how certain European countries were in the 19th century, were developing and posing theories based on that of economy and social transformation. And we need to learn about these things, of course we do, but we need to question how well these would serve our purposes. And the social transformation or socialist transformation has to be thought of in terms of the world now and today. And so I think he's actually falling into the trap of trying to repair capitalism, ironically, through his Marxist analysis, rather than breaking free of the exploitative military-industrial institutions and frameworks that Green New Deal advocates are saying have to be broken. And therefore he's falling into that trap of really being greenwashed and trying to repair. And so we have to look at what's missing. And again, I realize my time's running out, so maybe there'll be a chance to come back a bit later. But really, in the current theories of Green New Deal, what is missing is feminism, it's the women, and it's also, there's not enough being said about how we apply these things to the concepts, the very concepts, as well as the practices of the military. And so we've got to actually reframe and reimagine and reconstruct our notions away from national and nationalist security notions into internationalist cooperative security. And again, I'm going to actually talk about that much more in my longer lecture, which I'll be giving on the 17th. So running through that fairly quickly, it recognizes that the military has routinely destroyed and contaminated the lands of indigenous people and the lands of people around the world. And that has to be changed. And so a genuinely green and feminist New Deal would recognize the need to transform security relationships and go beyond decarbonizing economic and military activities into that whole set of issues. I can see that my time has run out, so I'm going to stop there and pick up some of those themes, I hope, in the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you for Rebecca's criticism on the Green New Deal and also introduce the young leadership in the current Extinction Rebellion movement. And the next speaker will be Jayati GHOSH from Nehru University, India. She is a professor of economics, and she is also secretariat of International Development Economics Associates, a South-based global network of heteros, economists, and other development practitioners. Please.
Thank you so much, Jayati. I'm sorry, my connection is a bit weak, so I'm not going to put on the video because I think it's safer to just use the audio while I can so that I don't lose you altogether. And it was fascinating to hear Rebecca. Thank you for that, for a very broad and sweeping discussion of the important issues. So much to agree with, and I have to be also honest and say so much that I disagree with. I'm particularly going to take up the issue of the Green New Deal and whether it should be global or not. And I may as well come clean and admit that I also am an economist, which is going to color my response to this. Essentially, I think whatever deal we have, I've argued that it should not be just green, it has to be multicolored. It has to be green, it has to be blue, looking not only at the oceans, but also at issues relating to peace. It has to be purple because it has to emphasize the care economy. And of course, feminists have argued for a long time about the importance of a purple economy. And it has to be red because it has to emphasize much greater egalitarianism. Now, of course, many people would argue that all these put together would equate to some kind of socialism, but I'm not going to get into that. It's not an issue of naming right now. But it has to be multicolored. None of this will work if it is not global. And that's because capitalism today is global, because imperialism is how it operates, and it operates through local elites, which is what makes our countries so unequal, and which is what makes any kind of greening also so much more difficult. So I think I'm going to explain why I think it has to be global in a minute, but let me just talk about the here and now, because one of my concerns is that all of our efforts for any kind of New Deal, green, purple, red, blue, all of these efforts have been massively set back by the global pandemic. And I think we have to recognize that. There's no point in pretending that we're in the world of a year ago, because we're not. Everything has changed. We are in what is conceivably going to be the deepest crisis that global capitalism has yet faced. But let's also remember that a crisis of capitalism does not in itself generate progressive alternatives. They have to be worked for, and most importantly, people everywhere have to be persuaded that it's in their best interests. And unfortunately, both of those, I think, still are areas where a lot of work needs to be done. So let me begin by talking about why this crisis is so severe and so important and so fundamental, and then talk about why that generates the need for a global approach. The pandemic has already created an economic depression of a kind that we have not seen since the Great Depression of the World Depression, in fact, of the 1930s. And it is likely to actually create a worse depression. And I say this advisedly. I'm not just being alarmist for no reason. I think that there is a real possibility of this becoming the most serious economic depression that the world has known for several centuries. Developing countries are already battered by the economic crisis created by this pandemic at a time when, in fact, the pandemic itself is yet to fully play out, when our infection rates are rising and we have no idea really about the extent, the severity, the length, and therefore the ultimate consequences. But we do know that they are already very, very major. This is coming at a time when global capitalism had already run out of steam. The health crisis is now more extensive and prolonged than anyone had imagined. The climate crisis, as has already been mentioned, was already upon us. And all of this, of course, means that solutions cannot be rehashed versions of the past and have to be a completely new approach. But also it means that developing countries are being battered, first of all, by the fact of declining exports, declining tourism revenues, volatile and in many cases declining capital flows, rising concerns about paying external debt, all of which have led to currency depreciations, which are making it harder and harder to access even essential imports, including those required for medicines. And all of these external headwinds are being dramatically affected by the decline in GDP that has been created because of lockdown. The economic activity has collapsed, which means employment and livelihoods have collapsed, which means that there is a general devastation across the developing world, which is not necessarily related to the health part. It's really related to lockdowns, which in many countries are being treated as law and order issues and control issues rather than public health issues. Now, because we are still in the rising phase of the pandemic, if you were really thinking about public health, this is the point at which we should have had lockdown. But most countries are being forced to open up because of the livelihood collapse, which has also generated collapsing government revenues. What does that mean? It means across the South, Governments are desperate for short-term fixes at any cost. There's little global assistance or solidarity. Instead, we find imperialism is still working in its usual ways through pressure, through finance, through pressure on countries to open up even more markets, and in all kinds of other ways. As a result, governments are actually looking more towards environmental deregulation, more investment in fossil fuels, opening up coal and oil sectors. So the pandemic is pushing us back hugely on clean energy. It's pushing us back hugely in terms of environmental deregulation, in terms of labor laws and labor protections, in terms of land rights of traditional landholders and forest rights of traditional forest dwellers. All of these are being affected. India is an extreme case. My own country, where I'm speaking from, we have very extreme moves in all of these directions of more deregulation, declining protection of labor, of land, of nature. All of this is very advanced, but we are not alone. Across the developing South, we are seeing this. And this is being encouraged by the North, partly because of the lack of global solidarity, and partly because Northern corporations are very at the forefront of encouraging these moves at deregulation in the ostensible ground that this will enable more investment. So what can be done, and what should we ask for, and how do we even think about a green or purple or red or blue or any color New Deal in these circumstances? And that is why I'm saying it has to be global as well as local. You cannot avoid looking at the global and at the international architecture. Everything you try locally will be destroyed by the effects of what is the outcome of what's going on globally. At the international level, what are the immediate things that we need to ask for? We definitely need immediately some resolution of sovereign debt, which is going to become a larger and larger issue, including in countries where at the moment public debt is not large, but private debt is. Because we all know that when that private debt reaches a crisis point and faces inability to pay, then the state is going to take it over and it's going to become a government debt problem, and it's going to become an issue of sovereign debt management. We still don't have adequate mechanisms. We still have a situation where a few private bondholders can hold the entire process to ransom. It's happening as we speak in Argentina, and it is causing a few rogue capitalists. I mean, capitalism itself is rogue, but we're talking about particularly criminal rogue capitalists who can hold entire countries to ransom, can prevent any kind of resolution, because these debts are still according to the laws of New York or the City of London. That's part of the way imperialism works. Until we have a globally recognized mechanism whereby this cannot happen and a few bondholders cannot prevent restructuring of debts, we're going to have a continued process whereby everything progressive and positive is undermined by these kinds of systems. We need a global issue of SDRs because developing countries are desperate for liquidity. And this is being prevented at the moment by the United States and India, of all countries, which shows you that the ways in which global political economy work are very complex, but they're not necessarily in the simple, straight north-south kinds of divides that we see. We need capital controls to be instituted and to be enabled and allowed by all developing countries so that they are no longer subject to the whims of finance capital that can force particular kinds of policies and can also create huge instabilities and crises. So all of these are global architectural changes that are necessary if we want to do anything at the national or local level. And therefore, it has to be global in scope. And we have to push for allies that can enable us to get these changes in the international architecture. We can't just simply sit back and say, well, you're not green enough or you're not red enough. We have to be willing to work with anyone who will enable these changes in the global architecture because otherwise we're not going to get anywhere. And I'm too old to sit back and say, well, when the socialist revolution comes, because I think we have to keep waiting for that, of course, and working towards that, but we also have to work towards whatever changes we can to actually enable some positive and progressive movements to be successful wherever they are. We have to remember that countries are not homogeneous. I've already mentioned that imperialism operates through local elites, but also that therefore the implications of many of the demands made by green movements have particular impact, especially often on the poor. That there are often those who feel that the attack on fossil fuel will not just deprive them of jobs, but will also affect their access to energy. We still have in India a very large proportion of households in rural areas who don't have access to electricity. And I believe access to electricity is today a human right. So we have to think of decentralized ways of energy resource creation, which will, whether it is solar or whether it is wind energy or various other methods, that will ensure that everybody has access. And we shouldn't be saying, don't do this, without also providing these local level alternatives. So we must be demanding of our governments that they support these. We must be demanding of international financial institutions that they support these local, decentralized kinds of things. We are going to need massive investment, massive public investment, certainly in the care economy and in health, but also in a whole range of things that enable greening to actually occur, to reduce the reliance on fossil fuels, to reduce the damage done to the environment by a whole range of industries. Shifting those industries, making them more ecologically sustainable will require massive investments. And those public investments in turn will require major resources. In the short run, right now, because there is a globalized, generalized collapse in demand, you can do this by printing money. You can borrow from central banks and just do it right now. But eventually someone will have to pay. And this is a moment where the redness of the deal has to come very sharply. We have to encourage much more taxation of the rich. And there are two simple, easy ways in which this can be done. Low-hanging fruit, as you might say. We can actually tax the wealthy. We know that the wealthy have actually gone crazy over the last decade in particular, but even over the period of COVID. We know that some of the richest people in the world got 37% richer in the last 4 months, while the rest of the world was in deep economic and health crisis. So the case for taxing the rich has never been stronger. It has been calculated in India, for example, that a 2% tax on just 965 individuals, 2% of their wealth, will be taxed for only 965 people, less than 1,000 people. And that would generate 1% of GDP. That would double the entire health budget of the central government. We would get a doubling of health expenditure by just taxing 965 people, 2% of their wealth, which they wouldn't even notice. Across the world, you will find similar kinds of numbers. Across the world, how do we ensure that they tax and that you can't just shift the money around? We need a global asset registry. Once again, therefore, international, global. It has to be people all over the world demanding this international asset registry, a global asset registry. We have to tax multinationals who can get away by not paying anything, especially the ones who have really benefited in this pandemic. The FANGs, you know, the Facebooks and Netflixes and Amazons and Googles and etc. They shift their profits around so that they claim that they're only making all their profits in the tax havens. If we adopt a system of unitary taxation where every country has the right to tax their proportion of the global profits according to the share in sales and employment, then you would not have any advantage in shifting these profits around. Then these multinationals will be forced to pay the same taxes as the national capitalists have to pay, which is not particularly unfair, I would think. These are very simple solutions, but they do require international cooperation, which means that if we want to do anything domestically for our people, we have to also encourage people, progressives across the world, to fight for these policies in their own countries, not just general demands for reducing emissions and for clean energy and so on, not general demands, but very specific policies that will enable all countries to follow these more progressive alternatives. And I think, therefore, we need internationalism more than ever. It has to be global, but it can only be global by being national, by citizens in every country putting pressure on our own governments. Final point I would like to make is that this is getting harder and harder because, as we know, there were already moves in this direction. But one thing the pandemic has done, it's come as a real gift to authoritarian governments. It's enabled suppression immediately of street protests, but it is also allowing for a kind of 360-degree surveillance and monitoring in the guise of public health once again, which is unbelievable and unprecedented. So it's harder and harder, actually, to get progressives to exercise pressure on governments. It's really at the moment happening the other way around. Governments are able to exercise pressure on progressives. How do we change that? We change that by being a little patient, thinking long term, thinking of broader alliances than we are used to thinking of, and thinking of exploiting every possible means available to all of us to actually get this message around to people. That it doesn't have to be at the cost of your livelihood, that in fact these short-term fixes that are being attempted will in fact eventually destroy your livelihood, that it's in your interest to push for these progressive alternatives. Okay, let me stop here. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Professor Jayati GHOSH. And the next speaker will be the Mithika MWENDA from the University of Witwatersrand, South Africa. He is a public policy analyst expert with vast experience on public policy processes. He has won several international awards and recognition due to his contribution to international environmental and climate policy processes. Most recent being named one of the 100 most influenced people in the world on climate policy in 2019. Please.
I need your guidance here. I sent my presentation. Should I share it from this end, or you have it on your end? So thank you.
Yeah. Okay.
So let me first start by thanking you for inviting me in this very important forum. And I'm actually based, as I speak, in Nairobi. We are a couple of hours behind you, you and others. And my discussion will center around the articulation of African perspectives in this. And just a moment, yes, I'm a PhD candidate in the University of Witwatersrand, but I handle the Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance. So just we are actually a collection of organizations from across Africa. We are around 10 years old, bringing together the strongest movement on climate justice in the African continent. And we have various organizing. And this is the perspectives I want to share with this very distinguished panel. So why we end to come together was just I've been listening to colleagues who have been making a presentation, and we felt that we did not have a voice as African. And what we needed to do is how do we, as we talk about South-South, North-South, global solidarity, how are we taking the voices of the most vulnerable people? So that is actually all the background, is trying to strengthen the voices of indigenous peoples, for instance, trying to look at where do we put the voices of smallholder farmers, where do we put the voices of the young people, the voices of indigenous peoples living with disability, and most importantly, the age. And so, looking then at Africa at a glance, talking about climate justice, this is actually what we talk, where we could talk about the embodiment of climate justice. So this is the region most vulnerable to climate change impacts, particularly and climate scenarios 1.5 degrees Celsius, and the most reports, including the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports, talks about Africa as most vulnerable, but also the continent which has contributed the least to global warming and the emissions into the atmosphere. And the climate change indeed poses systemic risk to African economies, infrastructure, water, food systems, public health, and like this COVID-19, the agriculture, and our livelihoods. And for your information, this is a continent which relies 95% of rain-fed agriculture. That is our economic ministry, susceptible to climate variability. And the more, again, if you look at this continent, 34 of 50 of all the LDC's countries come from this very unfortunate continent. So the 7 of the 10 countries that are most vulnerable to climate change in Africa in 2015, 4 Africans ranked among the 10 countries most affected. The Mozambique, you remember the hurricane, the Kenneth, which struck the country some 2 years ago. Malawi, Ghana, Madagascar. In 2018, climate-related disasters and already pushed 20 million people in 23 countries in Africa towards a crisis level of food insecurity. And 81 million people from 20 African countries, mostly in Southern, Eastern, and Southern Africa, were risk as we speak now, and actually is going to be exacerbated by this pandemic, starvation, as a result of the 50 years of drought. This is also the continent which has around 640 million people suffering energy poverty. And this is now the continent. So the continent, so when you look then at when it comes to the responses, particularly on finance, it remains a major issue in the continent. The response on taking action to climate change that are fair. So if we need to look at this, we need to look at fair, equitable, ecologically just, and responsive to the needs of those most vulnerable in this continent. And so, for us, climate justice means those who are primarily responsible for climate change and those whose mode of production and consumption has resulted in accumulation of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere own up to their mistakes, take deliberate measures to stop such mistakes. Number 3, for us, climate justice means those who have caused climate change should own up to their debt they have accrued from the victims of their action and compensate them accordingly. Then also, climate justice means giving those who have no voice and those who are feeling the biggest impacts of climate change sufficient space and voice to articulate their challenges and solutions because it is only when they participate in even shaping decisions, shaping policies without exclusion, that this is going to be sustainable to them. In other words, then, those at the front line of climate justice should be proactively engaged in such processes as UNFCCC, regional climate processes, as well as national and subnational conversations geared towards framing policies and other interventions to address climate change crisis. The other one is we understand that there has been deliberate exclusion of communities which really are supposed to be at the front line of these processes. Whereas this means climate justice, we need really to revert from the old ways of doing things, the old models of consumption and production, the fossil fuel carbon intensive development pathways, and embrace the pathways which balance between the needs of current and future generations. Climate justice means living in building consciousness where humanity lives in interdependence with nature. And then, of course, finally, is we look at climate justice is achieved when industrialized countries honor their financial commitment and provide sufficient resources to poor countries and communities to enable them build resilience, adapt and cope with the challenges of the problem which they have already caused humanity. I will underscore mention then that looking at the struggle which we have undergone through Africa in the advent of the climate justice movement in the world, the African region remains the embodiment, as I mentioned earlier, of climate justice in view of the challenges the continent faces in adaptation, in mitigation, technology development, capacity building, and all other pillars of the international conversations around climate change, and most importantly, the provision of resources and finance. In addition to the agitating for the principles of common but differentiated responsibilities and the respective capabilities in countries, which is very common in the multilateral processes, this Africa has been at the forefront of pushing for the expanded negotiations, where the participation of the civil society and other interest groups like indigenous people, farmers groups, human rights groups has increased exponentially over years. And I went to to look at the UNFCCC. If you look at the COP1, which was held sometimes more than 20 years ago, the number of the civil society and non-state actors was very minimal. But moving towards COP23, you realize that actually we have outnumbered the governmental actors. And this actually is very curious. So this blended presence of environmental, scientific NGOs and social movements, including trade unions and the human rights groups particularly, has undeniably liberalized the international discourse on climate change. And that's why you can see the movement of young people, then by my colleague was talking about Greta Thunberg, and those are the young people, young movement, and making UNFCCC organize annual conferences, and that is the gathering of actually of governments and non-state actors, only beaten by UN General. This is actually the second most important annual meeting of actors. Of course, I know there are people here who will tell me that it doesn't add value, but for us, that democratic participation of people who have been there, we have followed it and we have seen how it has evolved. And so to us, we have invented this climate space. And the most important by social movements, extinction movement, and those others. So we have expanded the conversation beyond the scope of UNFCCC and climate environmental scientific limits. But then the battle still continues. It has gone beyond the UNFCCC halls. If you look at the participation 10 years ago and what we are talking about here, I think we have reason to really believe that we are making progress in liberalizing the discourses and intervention on climate change. And now we have to acknowledge that the crisis is no longer about environment only, it is about the people, it is about society, it is about the economies of the world. And so when looking at the climate crisis, we look at the issue of poverty. How has it exacerbated poverty in the world? How, when you look at the issue of equity, how has it disproportionately affected poor countries, vulnerable sectors, and including women, indigenous peoples, people with disability, children, and the aged? When we look at the broader sense of justice into this, it has caused the disparity between the poor countries and the rich countries. It is a humanitarian issue, economically and politically. And so, when then, as the organization, we believe that it is more talking, and we don't believe in conversations which do not really have impact on people. So we have focused our mobilization what we call inside, outside, interventions. And so over the last 10 years, we have been really practically engaging this at a very high level. So we have particularly, and Patrick, I know, will perhaps speak after me, giving an example of the COP15 in Copenhagen. It was actually we used only to have participation of the civil society, which are environmental and mostly scientific. But when we went there as the movement, we are the ones who pioneered these walkouts you see, this movement, and that was the first time for us actually to say, no, this is not about, it is about people, it is not about the elite. We also have tried to ensure that we nurture the outside peoples. It's not only at the negotiations. It's like in the COP17 in South Africa. We organized a 7,000-kilometer trans-African caravan of hope, traversing around 11 countries in Eastern and Southern Africa. And the purpose of this was a walk, a caravan, which create awareness and connect the peoples, create awareness of the crisis of climate change. Because what we have observed is this discourse has been limited to governments only and then the negotiations. So we wanted actually to ensure that this is expanded and we demystify, simplify the discussions and link it with the livelihoods of people. We mobilize the farmers, we mobilize the young people, we mobilize the indigenous people, and you will see the thousands of people we were able to mobilize who are not in Durban, but felt part of this movement of the Caravan of Hope. We also, within that also, we have not limited that discourse even at national level or at regional level only. We have gone into countries. We have established very strong platforms, and right now we are in 48 African countries where we are silently mobilizing, and practically because we have participated, we have written papers, we have seen people do research and what, it is not about that. It is about working at community. How do we mobilize communities so that they can own this process? So in all these countries now we have designated national platforms where actually we have established a framework that it must involve the indigenous people, and we must shape the discussion at subnational level and at very small unit at community level. And then, of course, without now having those communities, how do we shape this movement in such a way that, as it linked to the people's daily efforts, food production, looking for water for those women who do not access water. For farmers, how are they going to farm? And how is the drought affecting them? How are the pastoralists really feeling this? Are we listening to them? So these are some of the things. So we have been able really to come up with a very strong framework, and then with other national and international and the global, we belong to various movements in building North-South collaboration. And the latest is with the one which brought people together ahead of the UN Secretary General's meeting in New York, where we came up with some key elements of community renewal or climate justice, that we need a new global socio-ecological contract. That is, which should be based on just transition and which leaves no one behind and reduces inequalities both and within countries, including gender, income, age, future generations, occupation, ethnicity, and what have you. Number two is a people-centered approach to climate finance. They are an approach which mobilizes financial resources commensurate with the needs of the most affected countries and empowers climate action by people, communities, smallholder farmers at very local level, and so forth. Then there's also element, the third element is a human right-based approach to climate action. They should be promote the right to a healthy environment and access to environmental justice, as well as protect the rights of environmental defenders and climate displaced persons. And here I hasten to also talk about the loss and damage framework of the UNFCCC, which has actually stalled because of disagreement on what would that mean to the people. Then fourthly is recognition of nature's intrinsic value in embracing genuine solutions for resilient building, adaptation, mitigation, and supporting traditional and indigenous communities' rights to their territories and the role in the protection of nature. And finally, inclusive climate governance, which should be based on full participation of youth, young people. So in a nutshell, as I conclude, I want to emphasize that we need to leave all citizens of the earth, whether the rich, poor, the powerful and the powerless, the haves and have-nots, the poor and the rich, should attempt to live within the planetary boundaries. And this means then, if we are talking about air pollution, ozone depletion, climate change, ocean acidification, chemical pollution, nitrogen phosphorus loading, fresh water withdrawals, land conversion, biodiversity loss, all these things, we should not overshoot our contribution to that. We need to live at the safe, that ecological ceiling, that regenerative and distributive economy, and the social foundation, which are driven with shortfall, not going very low on them. That is, how do we deal with the issue of water in social foundations, water, food, health, education, income and work, peace and justice, political voice, social equality, gender equality, housing, networks, energy, and so forth and so forth. So let me end there, and I'm very happy to share. I can see, I know I sent my PowerPoint presentation, but I have seen what was being shared is my key paper, which I contributed in just recently. So I hope that this will be shared, so that it is more than what we had written in our presentation with Patrick Ford. But I'm happy that we have this forum to share our practical perspectives, our practical feelings, our shared feelings, our lived experiences in coping with the climate crisis. Thank you, colleagues, and let's continue building the Southern solidarity, South-South solidarity, and North-South solidarity. No one can live alone. And just as I finish, I've listened to the previous speakers. And the first one was quite. I hope that we are going to share these presentations, and we are going to continue building this momentum of climate action and climate solidarity movement. Thank you very much.